So our next panel is going to really carry on from the very interesting remarks we heard from the ambassadors. And we're going to be talking more about cooperation amongst Central Asian states, the new dynamics, and what has changed. I would also like to begin by congratulating our Central Asian guests on the Nowruz Festival. I know it's a wonderful festival. We sometimes have celebrated it at Georgetown, very important festival. And then again, to acknowledge that we've just had this meeting of the 5 Central Asian leaders this week, and that really does indicate that there are indeed new dynamics amongst the Central Asian states. And we have a very accomplished panel to talk to us this morning with experiences in different areas. And our first speaker will be Dr. Sultan Akimbekov. He is the director of the Institute of Asian Studies in Astana, and for over a decade he's been involved in the development of Kazakhstan's policies. He's been an advisor to the president, head of the country's preeminent research institutions. He's also a prolific author, and he's just given me a copy of the English language version of his history of Afghanistan. It's probably, 900 pages? Yeah. So I'm looking forward to dipping into it. So we will start off with you.
Thank you very much. Is it possible? Yes.
Yeah, please, if you'd like to.
Thank you very much, dear ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Chairman. For me, it's a great opportunity to be here, especially very interesting panel, very interesting session, very interesting conference. Of course, the idea of cooperation in Central Asia nowadays, it's maybe most popular in our region and around our region, because a lot of people wait that this is a chance for 5 Central Asian countries to build not maybe the unity, but some cooperational system, some cooperation for better presence themselves in the international area, maybe because somebody said that we have potential that 5 countries with 70 million population, location in the so important, strategically important place in the world, in the center of continent, will play more important role in this region, not only in this region, but what is very important, they're all independent. Because you know that this region is, and nowadays continues the contradictions between superpowers, and not only superpowers like Russia, China, and United States, but also a lot of regional powers, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, India, Pakistan, and a lot of others. And of course, all this interest concentrated in our countries, and very difficult, and all our countries try to continue to do something like multivectoral policy in different principles, different ways, but multivectoral policies may be preference for in this kind of situation. But of course, in this case, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and others have their own, played their own role in this way. And of course, this idea that Central Asia will maybe have common values of the situation, common contacts with in the international area. It's maybe somebody said that this is absolutely win-win situation for all, because this is a new chance for Central Asia, like maybe new era for them. Because after 25 years, we have first time when Uzbekistan with us, but maybe 25 years, he will be made isolated and not actively participating in the process which had happened in this region. So that's something like enthusiasm, something like euphoria in this region and around. As I said, okay, this is a good chance for the region, good chance for all of us. But we need to know that this is a very important thing, that we need to understand that, of course, this is a win-win situation, because, for example, it's profitable for all participants in the region. For example, Tajikistan nowadays with Uzbekistan signed the agreement about cancel the visa regime, and for Tajikistan it's openness of new trade routes through Uzbekistan territory, because last maybe 10 years so Tajikistan was blocked and have not a chance to cross the Uzbekistan territory. And for Kazakhstan the same, because the attempts of Tashkent to do market transformation means that for Kazakhstan it's to open new markets. And nowadays, last meeting in March, President said that we need to increase maybe the trade between the Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan from 2 billion per year maybe to 5 billion per year. It means that for Kazakhstan it's new market, new possibilities, because nowadays, for example, this trade between Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, we exported to Uzbekistan 1 billion and 300 million US dollars, but Uzbekistan just $700. So this is profitable for us. Also, we have for us, it's open new ways in south direction, because southern countries, including Afghanistan, is one of the very important market for us, for our goods. And several years ago, it was very difficult to cross through the Uzbekistan territory, more profitable to go around through Turkmenistan islands than to visit in, for example, in Herat with some goods. And nowadays the situation absolutely changed. We have potential, we have development of this situation. But of course yes, another maybe preference for Kazakhstan, that we have also one additional strong partner in the continuing of multilateral policy. Because, for example, we understand that, of course, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, more dependent from, in some elements about financial aid, not only maybe project, but also the needs of the. And if Uzbekistan may be more stronger, it means that we possible to cooperate in some group of strong countries which have the independent policy and more independent in the situation when the relationship between the United States and Russia, in the situation when China raising the influence in this region and has attempts to be more important in this region and to have power. And of course, this is and this situation is very important, how motivation of Uzbekistan government, because we understand that, yes, Uzbekistan wants to be more stronger. Of course, this is absolutely understandable. But for us, it's very interesting that what is the motivation of Uzbekistan establishment? And first of all, of course, understandable, they need a market transformation of the society, because 25 years, they say, continue to be like maybe state capitalism in the conservative state capitalism like in the late post-Soviet period, late Soviet period of time, and without market transformation of the society. Somebody said that this is a preference for Uzbekistan, because nowadays it's possible to start from maybe to save the industrial potential, it's possible to start build a new economy, to start to transform the market to the market, free market, and it's more profitable, more without any problems, because all of us, we remember how difficult was the market transformation in the early 90s. But from other side, not the same situation, because we understand that maybe other point of view, that maybe 25 years they lost the time, because we nowadays have not such kind of problem like early 90s, but Uzbekistan need to do all the deals and maybe to go through this path these 25 years. And was the time is a big problem, because problem of this all attempts of Uzbekistan to be more stronger and to change situation in the region depends of potential to do market reform. If they have not successful in this way, it means the problem for Uzbekistan inside Uzbekistan and outside Uzbekistan will increase. And this is, for all of us, it's a big problem, because we, of course, hope that Uzbekistan will be successful. And we don't want that some difficulties. But we know when you try to organize market transformation, you meet, for example, social problem, maybe some poverty beginning, some mobility, because through the period of absolutely control by the state all elements of life in the inside country, of course it may be a very stable construction, but if we change situation, it means that situation will be not so simple, because not so strong, not so stable inside. Because we look through this situation through the period of 90s, and it's very well known for us. And so that another kind of problem, that Uzbekistan would have not enough time they are maybe they are going to be very happy, very hurry, They maybe to force this process, maybe because they have no time. But we know that, for example, the problem of, but not maybe another kind of problem, that nowadays, very interesting situation in the region. After 25 years of development, the center of region, trading, financial center, economical center, first time by 2000 year, transferred from Middle Asia, from Uzbekistan land to the steppe of Kazakhstan. It's a new situation, absolutely new situation. And of course, Uzbekistan establishment from Uzbekistan are not happy of this situation and want to change this situation. Of course, it's understandable. And so that if they try to do maybe the transformation process rapidly, it means that level of risks inside country will increase also. And this is a big problem. And of course, we understand that, of course, if Uzbekistan will meet some difficulties, but in the transformation, especially market transformation, it means that we know the examples of such things, because countries which strong central political power and some difficulties in their maybe inside country, in economic, maybe in some social situation, maybe examples of like China, maybe in some elements like Russia. It means that try to use more, change their policy, international policy, be more active, be more, maybe some elements more radical, especially for national interest. And we know that in Uzbekistan nowadays we have strong diasporas around in all their neighbors. In Kazakhstan, near 800,000 Uzbeks inhabitants, our local Kazakh, and also near 500,000 newcomers from Uzbekistan. In Kyrgyzstan, we have a strong Uzbek diaspora. And we remember that in the early 90s, Uzbekistan was maybe like a regional empire, because they very active participate in the process in Afghanistan, in Tajikistan through the civil wars. And so that, of course, Uzbekistan, we of course wish to our Uzbek neighbors all just success. But if Uzbekistan will meet some difficulties, we are maybe for us it's maybe more preference that Uzbekistan plays stabilizing role of stability in this region, not to be maybe more active in this position. And of course, other problem is the multi-vector policy, because we don't know how Uzbekistan will do it, because, of course, contradiction in the region not finished. We continuing. We understand that contradiction between the United States and Russia will continue. We understand that raising influence of China. We understand the situation of around Afghanistan will continue. And it means that for maneuvering, you need a strong position. We need very strong position. And Uzbekistan, in this case, in the beginning of this process. And we'll have this country the basis to continue such kind of role in the nearest decade. We don't know nowadays. And of course, I think if we are looking for cooperation process in this Central Asia region nowadays, from my point of view, this is, despite the enthusiasm and euphoria about cooperation, it seems to me that real cooperation, just based on the maybe all the leaders of the countries. In our case, it's Nursultan Nazarbayev and Shavkat Mirziyoyev. But other problems that all contradictions between countries will continue. We understand that, for example, water problem became worse in the next decade. And we understand that, for example, Afghanistan problem will not decide. We don't know how in the nearest years will be an American policy inside this country, according to this country. And in this situation, cooperation is impossible, because each country oriented for their own interest, and their own interest often connected with different countries. For example, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, more dependence maybe from China and Russia. Turkmenistan, absolutely maybe independent, but no contacts with somebody. And nowadays a lot of problem inside Uzbekistan. And other situations that we have absolutely different points of view. Each country has different interests, different positions, and different social and economical structure even. And if we return to the beginning of my speech, the main idea of success of all cooperation process, all process of deciding the problem in the region, just one, is the success of market reform in Uzbekistan. But I'm not sure that this process will be easy, and this process without any problem, will be without any problem. But of course, I wish our Uzbek colleagues just success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very interesting discussion. And we now turn to our next speaker is Ambassador John Herbst. He's currently the director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. He has had a very distinguished diplomatic career. Prior to the Atlantic Council, he headed the Center for Complex Operations at the National Defense University, and he has been ambassador both to Ukraine and Uzbekistan and consul general in Jerusalem.
Angela, thank you. And that was a very good presentation largely on Uzbekistan, so I'll be going over some similar ground, although with a somewhat different optic. I always like to start talking about Central Asia by noting that it is in fact the center of Eurasia, the center of Mackinder's Great World Island, and that it was once the center of the civilized world, go back 1,000 years. And that's something that needs to be constantly repeated, especially in a capital like Washington and Western capitals. So people understand we're dealing with a venerable civilization, people who at one time were used to running things, running the world. It was the great crossroads on the Silk Road, and it was a major geopolitical force in various forms. Although, of course, the last time that was true was when Tamerlane was active. So what, 500 or so years ago, a little bit longer than that. But again, the peoples of this area are peoples who were once world leaders. And after a period where it became something of a geopolitical backwater, we're seeing Central Asia emerge again. In the post-Soviet world, Central Asia has become its own region, a surprisingly stable region, which you'll never know from reading the commentary of people who talk about it. And Uzbekistan is, in fact, the center of Central Asia. It borders all the 4 other countries that emerged from the post-Soviet, in the post-Soviet space. And it had a very particular history up until 2 years ago. I had many dealings with President Karimov. He was a strong leader. He established a strong state in Uzbekistan, and that was no small achievement. But he also had his peculiarities. And he had, in effect, a jaundiced view of his neighbors. And relations between Uzbekistan and all of its neighbors were complex, to use a diplomatic phrase. And we've seen emerge under President Mirziyoyev, and he's been in power less than 2 years, a very fast and I would say sincere effort to change all that. And when the center of a region moves from a certain protective stance vis-a-vis its neighbors to an opening and to a recognition that you need to have cooperation with the neighbors in order to address your own problems, in order to spur your own development, you have a very different geopolitical situation. And we have seen very clear steps, again from the earliest days, from September of 2016, to improve relations in the area. Now, Ambassador Kazakhanov mentioned that trade among the Central Asian states is very low, under 10%. And there's no question that when countries are not in close economic contact with each other, when they are neighbors, that is bad for the neighborhood. And so the outreach we've seen from Tashkent for almost 17, 18, 19 months now is very, very important, and it augurs well for the future of the region. The outreach has come, and it's been mentioned by other speakers already, on border rectifications between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, actually Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. We've seen it in the renewal of air service between Tashkent and Dushanbe. We've seen it in a new visa regime between Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And we've seen it, perhaps most importantly, in an area that was a flashpoint, and that is on water. The whole question of the Rogun Dam, which was once perhaps a casus belli, is now becoming an area where Uzbekistan and Tajikistan are talking in a serious way, and we will, I think, likely see a peaceful outcome in these talks. The greatest, perhaps, ecological tragedy on the planet, the Aral Sea, something which I remember President Karimov complaining when I was working in Tashkent, has been overstudied. And he was kind of right about that. There were many, many studies on the problem, but very few, if not, or no steps, except those which Kazakhstan was able to take wholly within its own purview, involving the Sirdarya and the northern part of the Aral Sea. I think this is now open to possible cooperation, although I don't want to be too rosy because the problems with the Aral Sea, the overuse of water, and the Amudarya are substantial. We've seen the reinvigoration and the emergence of new regional fora over the past 18 or 20 months. We've seen the emergence, as discussed earlier, of the C5+1, meaning Afghanistan. We've seen a renewal of former Secretary of State Kerry's initiative for the US plus the 5 Central Asian powers. I was in Tashkent, I was in Samarkand in November for a conference which the Uzbeks put on, which they smartly also arranged to have a regional leaders meeting and a meeting between the Central Asian 5 plus the EU. So a smart bracketing together of various fora, again, showing an opening to regional cooperation, which we had not seen before. And now we see this new forum of Central Asian leaders, which met for the first time in Astana last week. So all these openings, I think, are real, and they will produce concrete results, albeit with some cautions. We heard some good cautions about the different national interest of the 5 Central Asian states. So we don't want to be too Pollyannish. But again, the prospect of progress where there was very little prospect 2 years ago is very much real. Now, perhaps the single most important thing beyond the border rectifications that we've seen and the possibility of greater trade, the possibility of cooperation on water, is the issue of internal reform in Uzbekistan. Now, President Mirziyoyev has been very clear. He wants to see some easing of government control. And there's no question that the economy of Uzbekistan has been overregulated by the state. We've seen serious steps on perhaps the single most important issue for easing the role of the government in the Uzbek economy, and that is steps towards currency convertibility. We've seen some release of political prisoners, and we've seen some changes in personnel, particularly on the security side, that suggest some leavening of the political system in Uzbekistan. So these are all promising straws in the wind. But I use that phrase, straws in the wind, because they're not completely solid. I left Uzbekistan as a US diplomat in July of 2003. I only went back for the first time last November. I attended that conference in Samarkand and then went to Tashkent. I had some excellent meetings in Tashkent with some well-placed officials. And what they said to me was roughly the following. Yes, changes are in the works here in Tashkent. Yes, and this was something a little bit new, while they should be associated with the new president, they in fact were starting to be felt even before the transition. But they also cautioned me that on the domestic side, don't be overly optimistic. This is Uzbekistan after all. Don't expect the changes to come too fast. And in fact, in the last 5 or 6 weeks, we've seen some indications that they were giving me very sound advice. There's very clearly, if you read what's being written, and again, you have to, the politics and the policies of Uzbekistan have a Delphic element. So it's not all right out there in public debates and public discussions. We've seen some pushback on currency convertibility. And I remember very well from my time in Tashkent, we had the promise of serious currency convertibility and how there was pushback starting in the summer of 2002. So we'll see how far convertibility goes. And that will be a very clear indicator of how quickly economic reform and liberalization will take place in Uzbekistan. And it's hard to overemphasize the importance of this because Uzbekistan is not only the central country by geography in Central Asia, it is the largest in terms of population and has a very, very talented people whose ability to develop the country is limited by overregulation from the state. So we need to see clearer signs that that regulation is easing. In the long run, I am optimistic, but that could allow for some very uneasy moments over the next year or 2 or 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Herbst. That was, again, great talk. So our next speaker is Dr. Roger Kangas. He's the academic dean of the Near East South Asia Center for Strategic Studies, which is at the National Defense University of the U.S. Department of Defense. He is also an adjunct professor here at Georgetown University. He's also a graduate of Georgetown University, I'm glad to say, one of 2 that are on our panel today. He's held positions at the George C. Marshall Center for European Security, the Central Asia Institute at Johns Hopkins University, the Open Media Research Institute, and the University of Mississippi. He has been engaged in Central Asia for all of his professional life, and we welcome your remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela, and I should say to the team here at CERES for putting this event on. The annual gathering together of people to discuss security challenges in the region of Central Asia is becoming, I think, a mainstay here in the DC area. I'm also honored to be part of this panel. Some outstanding views already expressed, and I know soon to be expressed. In the time I have, it's interesting, we've been looking at changes in the region, and I think you've been gathering a theme here, right, of optimism and enthusiasm, sometimes guarded about what's to take place in the region, what is taking place, whether it's personnel changes, policy changes, real engagement among and between the countries of Central Asia. And I think it's appropriate we say these things at this time. After all, in less than 2 weeks, the American baseball season begins, and every team is optimistic that they will win the World Series. And so spring is a time of hope for all, except weather forecasters, but that's another issue. So what I'm going to look at, in my time, is really delving into the issue of security. And how the states in the region perceive security, both sort of looking at their public statements, but also the analysts who describe it. And I was glad that John Herbst sort of made a quick aside about analysts sometimes looking at the region in rather pessimistic tones, and I would say the security field, there's a plethora of this. And so what we'll do is we'll simply look at, well, how are they characterizing security? What are the key challenges? What real changes are taking place today? And what does this mean for regional cooperation, which is the theme of this panel? To be very brief on what are the themes, we could go on this for the rest of the day, but I can sum it up by saying there are pretty much 4 elements that we can envision. First, of course, is this issue of state and border consolidation, and you've heard a fair amount of that already. Again, we go back to 1990-91, the creation of these states, and of course, over the years, tensions that existed about border maintenance, border management, and where demarcations should take place. There was a time where you could cross over easily, not have visas stamped, just go from one country to the next, to a period where minefields are placed on the border. This, of course, has an adverse effect on economic trade, also on human interaction, connectivity amongst the citizens of the various countries. And yes, at times there were blockades, obstacles put in the way to limit intra-regional trade and trafficking. Secondly, there was the concern of internal violence. And interestingly, of course, we tend, that is, those outsiders who look at the region tend to gravitate to 2 key moments, right? The Tajik civil war of the 1990s, the ethnic unrest in Kyrgyzstan in 2010, notions that the Fergana Valley, the Rasht Valley, and other places are going to be hotbeds of extremism, instability, and conflict. And yet, more often than not, it has remained more peaceful than unstable, but obviously the concern of the potential risk of violence is there. Thirdly, the concerns of transnational threats, and this really becomes the centerpiece of how the regional actors view security in Central Asia. If we think in terms of terrorist groups, from the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan to concerns about Taliban spillover or the so-called Islamic State, Daesh, entering into Central Asia, this becomes the quintessential challenge for the countries involved. And we see this, of course, in their national security documents and official statements from all leaders. If you were to prioritize what's the concern, it's extremism, it's terrorism, somehow wedded in there is drug trafficking, of course, this multi-billion-dollar business that's going on. If we name a country, it's almost inevitably going to be Afghanistan, as noted earlier. This country, again, whether we look at its instability and implosion of the 1990s, the resurgence of violence last decade, and even what the status of that country is today, whether there can be a consolidation of power or not, vexes the Central Asian states. And C5+1 meetings or C5+ Afghanistan efforts tend to focus on this southward security issue. And just one last concern, of course, well, it's about international partnerships and cooperation. And it's fascinating because as we look at these challenges of borders, of violence, and of transnational threats, more often than not, countries worked individually to address these. There was a perception of what these threats were, and the national ministries, whether it's Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, would address them individually. Collective action was done in fits and starts. There would periodically be a conference, a summit, some sort of gathering, but ultimately mutual suspicions and mistrusts stymied any effort at cooperation. I would argue, as one who spent a number of years trying to work security cooperation programs in the region, one of the most difficult decisions you had to make at the beginning was, where do you hold the event? Because if you held it in this country, participants from another country would not attend. You often had to hold it outside the region to ensure that all 5 partners would show up, and invariably one would bow out at the last minute. And this was a real nightmare, not just for Americans, for Russians, for Chinese, but for the Central Asian countries themselves. even a large sort of formal structure like the Collective Security Treaty Organization, we see different perceptions of this. Some view it as an essential structure. Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, fairly well embedded into the Collective Security Treaty Organization architecture. Others are involved, but rather disappointed, Kyrgyzstan. And others have tried it, but don't deem it worthwhile, Uzbekistan, and yet another simply wants to remain out of it. And of course, this is Turkmenistan. So what changes today? If this is the pattern we've seen over the last quarter century, are there any changes? Very quickly, too good to perhaps worrisome. The change of the Uzbek government, I don't need to dwell on this because my colleagues and other speakers have noted this already. I would add that it's not just a personality change, but there's a sense that a new generation is coming in that perhaps is not seeing the region through Soviet-era lenses. And this is an important evolution that we simply have to wait and see how this goes. Will people not see things in a zero-sum setting? Will they see things in a more collaborative manner? Again, we have to wait and see. And this is tied out in the relationship among the neighboring states. The conference held last fall in Samarkand was a very important one. In Astana this month, I should say, also critical, that we're actually seeing regional events hosted by the countries in Central Asia. It's not outsiders dragging them together. It's individuals and leaders in the region bringing each other together to talk about the cross-border challenges, to talk about the regional concerns in Central Asia, which is a far cry from in the past when decisions were made and retaliatory measures were enacted across the border. I would say, though, on the negative side, two things to consider. First is the changing dynamic in Afghanistan. It was asked sort of perhaps rhetorically, what's going to happen, what is the U.S. policy, and what is the future of Afghanistan? Quite frankly, the only thing one can say at this stage is the U.S. is not leaving, but what presence are they going to hold? What role will they play in the region? Is it more of assistance? Is it more of training? And not really engaging in the counterterrorism operations or in the reconciliation operations that need to take place. What about the inclusion of other actors? India, for example, which is playing a much stronger role in Afghanistan. What about the role of China? Again, something important. Other efforts in the past that have taken place, 6+3, et cetera, may be by the wayside, but this new initiative of the C5 plus Afghanistan suggests that there's hope that discussions will be with Afghanistan, not about Afghanistan. And I think that's a critical evolution. It's not about building a wall on the Amu Darya and blocking Afghanistan out, but trying to figure out how to bring them into a broader regional discussion. And the last issue is simply the return of so-called foreign fighters as a security threat that we're now seeing more and more on the radar screen of Central Asian countries and their security forces. Again, the numbers on this are guesswork. There's quite a bit of analysis done, whether it's in the hundreds, the thousands. Your guess is as good as mine. And I think a number of these ranges suggest that, are we looking at individuals just from Central Asia or Central Asians who have migrated elsewhere who were radicalized in those third countries, be it Russia or a European state? With the complete demise of the administration in Raqqa and the demise of the ISIS forces in Syria and Iraq, the question is, where did they go? Are some staying put in the Middle East? Are some migrating to other locations, such as Europe? Or are any returning to Central Asia? And we do know that this last trend is happening, that there is a slow but steady progression of returning foreign fighters into Central Asia. The question is, how do the respective countries deal with them? How does Tajikistan deal with them, knowing, for example, that Tajikistan has a fairly significant representation amongst foreign fighters in Syria, perhaps because of Mr. Khalimov's activities, but also other draws that took them out of Russia. Does this involve rehabilitation and inclusion? Does this involve incarceration or extermination? All options are on the table. Other countries have tried these. Just talked to the Saudis about this. They're here in town, and this has been a front and center issue on their plate. Ultimately, is this an existential threat for Central Asia? No, but it could create ungoverned spaces or areas where there are challenges within Central Asia that would prohibit what I would see as a real, genuine integration and a stable integration of the region. So to sum up, what is the, if you want to say, the impact or the so what of these security evolutions, developments? I'm not going to get into the role of individual outside actors and what they could play. We're going to have a whole panel on that this afternoon. And in particular, from the US perspective, which I normally would love to talk about, we have a significant voice from our State Department as our lunchtime speaker, so I will leave it to Walter Scott Reed to address that. What I will say, though, is that for each of the countries who work with Central Asia on security matters, the engagements are going to remain constrained and limited, largely because of budget reasons and also, quite frankly, because of priorities elsewhere. It is not that Central Asia is unimportant, but rather other regions are sometimes seizing the attention of these external actors. And I would say the same with international organizations, be it NATO, the OSCE, UNODC, and even the discussed Shanghai Cooperation Organization that we heard about this morning. What I would say in the end is that in Central Asia, security is viewed through the lenses of both intra-Central Asian dynamics and increasingly the changing role of these external actors that seem to be limiting themselves in the region. The good news is that boundaries between the states are perhaps becoming less walls and more doors to and among each other. If this is really an evolutionary change, if this can take hold, we will see a more effective way to address transnational threats. Because quite frankly, the only way you can manage drug trafficking and terrorist groups, extremist groups, is to talk to each other and is to work with your neighbors. And finally, in terms of security, while Russia and the West will be important and remain important in discussions, my personal opinion is increasingly we need to see this region as part of Asia. It's something that I know we'll hear about later today. But before we think that this is the grand solution, and if I'm in Central Asia, I think this is going to be answer to all of my concerns, be wary. Whereas you sometimes have complained about Russia and the West marginalizing interests in Central Asia, the security challenges on the Asian continent are just as complex, and likewise Central Asia could see itself peripheral in these discussions. So as a crossroads region, I believe Central Asian states and leaders know this all too well, and hopefully will be willing to address them. But I look forward to addressing your questions later on. With that, I'll close my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger.
Okay.
Very informative. So our last speaker today is Dena Sholk. She's a senior research analyst and head of representation for IHS Markit in Astana in Kazakhstan. She is a graduate of Georgetown University. She has a dual BA, MA degree. Her MA is from CERES. And I have to say, she wrote an extremely interesting thesis, which I read, about the culture of the bazaar in Kazakhstan. She lived in Kazakhstan for a year while she was a student and worked in a bazaar. But today, she is in fact going to talk about the energy relations among the Central Asian states.
Thank you, and Nowruz Mubarak to everyone, and thank you, Dr. Stent and CERES. It's always great to be back. So I'm here talking about energy relations in Central Asia, and let me first sort of walk through the structure of my presentation. First, I want to outline the status of current energy relations, energy interconnections. Where do we stand? Then I want to give more of a high-level overview of the Eurasian Economic Union and what are the specific plans and likely implications of the different energy strategies, specifically in the power market, which is set to go into effect in July 1st, 2019, as well as the integrated or common oil, gas, and oil products market that is supposed to go into effect January 1st, 2025. And this sets the framework for a discussion on Uzbekistan, really how is the new president changing energy relations, or really what's that orientation, and prospects for future cooperation. That said, I also want to note that this will be generally high level, as energy matters tend to be long and integrated, or long view and integrated and complex. So where do we stand? When we're discussing energy relations and integrations, it's important to both look by fuel type, but also generally, what are these individual markets' policies? So in Eurasia region, generally, our net energy exporters are Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. Our net importers, Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Beyond that, just on a general level, in terms of crude oil, yes, Kazakhstan is a major exporter. That said, in terms of crude consumption in the region, a lot of Russian imports, and we're likely going to see that increase more with the conclusion of the 5 million ton agreement with KazTrans, KTO and Transneft and Uzbekneftegas for the new refinery if it realizes, but also increased products. A lot of gas oil increased by deliveries by rail, fuel oil, et cetera. And even Kazakhstan's Pavlodar refinery that was designed to handle crude from the Ural Mountains, and that level of Ural region, that level of sulfur. And with the expansion of the Tian pipeline, that will continue. But beyond that, in terms of electricity, most of them are self-sufficient, but there is a small amount of electricity trade between Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, a small amount between Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. Western Siberian power market is essentially a balancing market for Kazakhstan. Beyond that, coal, while the rest of the world, after these last few months under the recent administration aside in the US are moving away from coal. In Central Asia, coal is actually extremely important. You're even seeing Uzbekistan, which around 90% of electricity consumption comes from gas-fired power generation. You're seeing even efforts to increase on-grid production after the expansion in the 2 CCGT units there in 2016. And Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, to enhance domestic self-sufficiency, are also increasing coal production. As you know, in Kazakhstan, 60% of electricity comes from coal. So coal is still important here, and self-sufficiency is. And finally, in terms of gas, Kazakhstan mostly reinjects gas or has a small exchange agreement with Gazprom in the north, and that also has a linkage to Uzbekistan in the south in terms of volumes. Uzbekistan exports some small volumes of gas to southern Kazakhstan. Turkmenistan essentially sends it all to China. And you're actually now, as of yesterday, if anyone saw in the news, there's discussions of actually reviving the Uzbek-Tajik gas trade for very small amounts, but this was cut off in 2012. So again, there's very little bits of interconnections, but there are opportunities and small, and they sort of exist. But beyond that, we've heard about the Eurasian Economic Union, and we're talking about integration and all these ideas, and yes, that's all lovely, but what does it actually mean on a more concrete level, and what are the priorities? So currently within that, and to rehash, the Eurasian Economic Union currently includes Armenia, Russia, Belarus, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And again, in these areas, Russian entities have an important role. Gazprom owns Armenia's, Belarus's, and Kyrgyzstan's gas distribution companies. But beyond that, there are agreements to have harmonization of rules, policies, and standards. In the gas market, there's discussion of using either an export netback parity pricing or market pricing policies. And these discussions are ongoing, and members have yet to come to an exact agreement. But I want to caution with the Eurasian Economic Union that integration will be very slow and will be very gradual because the devil is in the details. And let me give an example in terms of gasification. Those who follow the region know that gasification of Astana is a major priority. The president would like the Saryarka pipeline built by 2020. And the price for end users proposed is around 47 to 50 tenge per cubic meter, which amounts to around $147 to $155 per 1,000 cubic meter. What most people don't realize is this is going to be Russian gas, and Gazprom's average export price was around $197 in 2017, and we're looking around similar numbers in 2018. Meanwhile, the price that Tajikistan is receiving from Uzbekistan, if the Talco deliveries go through, is around $120 per 1,000 cubic meter. So when we're actually looking at, okay, let's say we're buying this price, which by the way in Kazakhstan, 147 is an enormous sum for gas, especially for gas to power, that means you're increasing end user electricity tariffs, and that means prices will go up. And this is a huge sensitivity. We've seen this in gasoline and light diesel consumption debates. But there's a certain level of sensitivity. What's your economic model? What do your citizens expect? And what are views of utility companies? Are they public goods like they were in the Soviet Union? Or do utilities have to have a profit and be able to reinvest in flexible generation, for example, to be able to accommodate greater renewables in line with Kazakhstan's long-term goals of reaching 50% renewable generation by 2050? And so all this is to say that yes, integration is good, but it will be slow and it will be complex, and there are many, many national level details underpinning that. And because of that, it's important to note for the Russian speakers here that in the text of these agreements, they're общий рынок. They're not единый рынок, which means they're common, they're not unified markets. And in that, nations are allowed to maintain sort of policies that would allow defending national interests and national monopoly players. So that's there's a nuance in integration. It can only go so far. With Uzbekistan, how does the new leader affect efforts? And I won't repeat what many of my colleagues said about increasing rail links, et cetera. And you've seen in certain areas some more liberalization, reduced car tariffs for Belarusian trucks, as well as Kazakhstan light vehicles, and that was a controversial issue for a while. But anyways, in terms of the energy sector, Uzbekistan, as many of you know, is a major producer, around 56 BCM of gas per year, but around 45 BCM is consumed domestically. Most of Uzbekistan's power generation comes from gas. And while we've seen a bit of a decline, and as you see there, mostly in the south near Bukhara and the southern regions is the heart of Uzbekistan's oil and gas production, very little liquids and condensate coming out of there. But you see the head of Uzbek Nefti Gas with ambitious plans to effectively double production by 2022, and there's interest in attracting new partners. But again, this was even during the Karimov era where tax exemptions were granted on exploration and production in Pakistan. And there was actually a recent discovery in January in that area. But still, long term, we see basically most of the production coming from these areas. Meanwhile, the leadership, though, has taken efforts to try to actually attract more upstream investment. There were new tax measures introduced in April 2017, basically allowing investors who invest in current upstream projects to get a tax benefit. Because beyond that, Uzbekistan effectively has two major projects, both Lukoil PSAs, though the new agreements with Gazprom for the 25 years of independence field, as well as ongoing work on Gel field, which is also in Pakistan, may lead to success. But still, the government is looking to actually increase production, and perhaps we'll see that. And they've taken many measures in that respect, but they're also taking measures consistent with Karimov's energy policy to increase domestic capacity for refining. So we saw the Ustyurt gas chemical complex that was launched. We're seeing more efforts. For example, Novaya Azot just acquired a methanol to gasoline production unit from ExxonMobil. It's only small, about 100,000 tons per year, but 100 tons, excuse me, per year, but it's still a step in the right direction. And we're also going to be seeing the completion of Kandim Phase 2 by June this year. So yes, there has been an increase in investment or new projects coming online, but it's still generally slow in that area. Oh, wrong. Meanwhile, Uzbekistan is kind of sort of increasing production, or at least trying to increase investment and continue in there. There's still other areas in the power market I just want to highlight. The country is, in fact, looking to increase renewable generation. Uzbek Energo operates around 38 power plants, but only 5 of them basically present 85% of the electricity, and it's primarily gas-fired. And so there are expectations, and even in the recent presidential edict, on expanding CapEx for renewable projects. So looking at Uzbekistan, looking at the general orientations, kind of where does that stand for future energy integration? First, generally, if we're looking at expanding ties and expanding flows of different products between the members, it will be very slow and it will be gradual, and it requires liberalization both of policies and prices. Yes, they may have all been former Soviet republics, but at the same time, they've been independent countries for 25 years now with different pricing policies, different policies on infrastructure access, third-party access, different policies on geographical permits for selling LPGs or gasoline. These all need to be rectified for true integration to move forward. Second, Russia will continue to play an important role, particularly with respect to crude imports as well as oil products, so gasoline, diesel, fuel oil, et cetera. And we expect this to intensify with the launching of deliveries by Gazprom Neft through Omsk recently, and this follows up the agreement made by Mirziyoyev. Though I have to say Gazprom Neft in 2016 sent around 10,000 tons of crude per month to Fergana refinery. So this is in some ways continuing. But beyond that, Uzbekistan's opening, I think echoing the sentiments of many of my other colleagues, yes, there is optimism, yes, there is an opportunity, but again, it will be extremely gradual. Uzbekistan's gas market, despite the optimism, is tight, and there will only be very marginal volumes of gas, for example, going to other areas, or even power imports coming into Uzbekistan, not more than, if even 10% of total consumption. So the opportunity is there, but again, many of these structural details really need to be reconciled, and I think political agreements first, and then we'll see what happens. So, yeah.
So I think we've had a common theme here, which is there is optimism, but it's cautious optimism, and there's also consciousness of the things that could derail some of the closer cooperation. I think I'm going to give the audience a chance to ask questions. We have a few minutes for questions. Any questions for our speakers? Okay, yes.
Thank you. Sébastien Perrou, Central Program, George Washington University. I have a question to Ambassador Herbst. I mean, I totally agree with you. There are so many reforms going on in Uzbekistan. So many things are changing so quickly. I was in Uzbekistan last October. It was really amazing to see how things are changing in so many sectors. But at the same time, I mean, we know that there is some resistance against these reforms inside the Uzbek administration for, I mean, several reasons. For example, how to say that? Well, in a neo-patrimonial state, you have an old generation who is afraid of losing its economic interest, with plenty of people afraid of losing their position. So my question is, in your opinion, what are the risks to see these reforms or some of these reforms slowed down or even stopped? To what extent this movement of reforms in Uzbekistan is sustainable? Thank you.
I think you're right that there are institutional and also informal impediments to serious economic change. I think, too, that Uzbekistan has had since independence, and actually I'd even say before independence, a remarkably stable political elite, which has been able to make changes or to make personnel decisions without major conflict, which has provided a serious amount of stability at the top of the country. And I'm not sure that that elite ultimately will endorse major change. The requirements of development in the modern world are for a great loosening of state control. My sense, and it's only a sense, this cannot be proved, is that there are some people in positions of authority around President Mirziyoyev, and maybe the president himself, I don't know, who understand that. Whether they have enough oomph internally to make sure reform progresses in a serious way is a question. And we will see how this question is played out over the next several years. I referred to some pushback on currency convertibility. Watch this space really closely. It is probably going to be the clearest indicator, one way or the other, of how things proceed.
Anything to add to that? Okay. Any other questions?
Hi, thank you all for this great panel discussion. My name is Tian. I'm a graduate student in the Asian Studies program at Georgetown. So my question is specifically addressed to Ms. Sholk. So you present us a very interesting and optimistic prospect of Central Asia's regional energy integration. So I think my question is two-part. The first is, what do you think is China's role in this regional energy integration? Because China has been investing in Central Asia China gas pipeline and investing a lot of upstream resources in the region. So do you think the Chinese investment is going to be a boost to the regional energy integration, or it's going to be more of a bilateral relations between China and individual Central Asian country? And the second question is, as you must be aware of, there are a lot of projects going on trying to export Central Asia energy to South Asia, so say Gaza 1000 and two-tap projects. So I'm also curious on your take about how this regional energy export, how that's going to impact on the internal regional energy integration. Thank you.
Well, thank you. First, I thought I gave a negative outlook on energy integration, so I'm glad it sounded optimistic. The opportunity is there, but I think it will be very difficult and very long and expensive. And I would say with any energy transition, any world or any country, everyone wants it, but no one wants to pay for it, first of all. Let me answer the second question on Casa 1000 2-tap, and I'll put TAPI into that. TAPI, we have an extraordinarily negative outlook on. It's a $5 billion capex. $200 million has been raised from a bank loan. There are market access issues in India, despite some of their new reforms, but that mostly affects the offshore fields and some of the LNG imports. So no, Casa 1000 and 2-tap, my power specialist would be able to tell you more about that. But essentially, it's a matter of price with a lot of these things, and also a matter of getting the right generation somewhere. They've been under discussion for a long time, and I think that at least in doing the balances and looking at the fuel consumption there, I don't necessarily see those coming into fruition yet, simply because of pricing issues and working that out. But I know that discussions are underway. I don't know if you know more on that. But China's role, very important as an investor, and I'll say two projects. One of their projects in Uzbekistan, only small, around plateau production is around 2 BCM per year. It's in the Sirdarya region. That one actually started production this year, or started development this year, ramping up, not yet at peak levels. Beyond that, they actually have an ongoing coal project in Kyrgyzstan. There's also investment in some of the new Uzbek coal projects under the new Uzbek coal strategy that seeks for increasing Angren production and developing an entirely new basin in a matter of 5 years. Beyond that, Chinese investment in Kyrgyz roads. I've driven from Bishkek to Issyk-Kul, fantastic road there, whereas if you go to other regions, not so much. That was Chinese built. So in many ways, yes, China is helpful in that respect as a willing investor. But I think at the same time, and I'll say in Kazakhstan, Mangostal gas, for example, they're still operating according to Kazakh laws. They're not wielding a certain amount of influence. So I'd say, yes, Chinese investment is there, but I think sometimes we often over-politicize it. There's still investors that have to abide by the national laws in accordance with all the other accounting and admin standards.
Any other questions? Okay.
Just a very quick question. We've heard an awful lot about various forms of cooperation, but there's been a special amount on energy cooperation. Considering that the Caspian Sea itself, the Caspian Basin, is a source of great energy for the region and great reserves, great projects underway already. Would it make sense, I asked the panelists, to expand the definition of Central Asia to include Azerbaijan?
Ah, yes. Interesting question. Who would like to take that?
I have two things on that. One, I don't know if increasing a definition is necessarily, maybe it's because I'm a consultant and just look at oil prices or deals, but I don't know if, at least on a practical level, if increasing the definition is important. But I would say three things on the Caspian. As you know, there are discussions about between the littoral states for designating that. Second, BP's project, the PSA in Azerbaijan, was extended and on great terms this past year, and that was unexpected and welcomed, which we still haven't seen in Kazakhstan. As you know, the three PSAs, they expire in 2033, 2030, and 2041. They haven't been extended, and yet if you're going to look at a Kashagan Phase 2, that has to be extended beyond 2041. But beyond that, there's also discussions on pearls, which is the Shell-led PSA that includes Oman Pearl, Shell, and KMG, and integrating that with some of the fields in the NCOC acreage. So there are discussions about Caspian Sea. You have Lukoil, what's it called? They're one project ramping up in the northern Caspian in Russian territory, and then Kashagan field. Yeah, so, no, not Kashagan, the Lukoil one in northern Caspian. The name is escaping me. So there is work going on in the Caspian. It's just that that's a relatively expensive basin, long winters, in the low oil price environment, especially when you have oil in other parts of the world. In the US, why go to an exotic place for the destination? Though you do need longer term, more investment in the Caspian because of the CPC expansion. I mean, you need more investment. You need the prolongation of the PSAs. So I would actually argue it's more market forces.
So Roger, do we remove Azerbaijan from the Caucasus and put it in Central Asia?
No, see, this is one of these, I would call cyclical problems, right? I mean, at first it was central, the South, or the Caucasus and Central Asia, then South Caucasus and Central Asia. Now let's separate them administratively in the US. The Caucasus are in a completely different bureau than Central Asia, and so we tend to think of them differently. It's interesting in the region, and you do see different perceptions, if you want to say, of the other. If I go back to 91, 92, Karabakh War is going on. There was a great deal of support for the Azerbaijani side within Central Asia communities that I was working with. This was a collective action. That same perception does not exist today. These are seen in different realms, and I think even the point raised of looking in other directions of southward, and I agree actually on the notions of the north-south challenges. It's the economic factors, and there's also a perception factor. South Asians looking northward still see this as alien territory, and vice versa, even though there are some areas of cooperation. But Azerbaijan, we can go to Georgia, Armenia, are seen just in a different light. Unfortunately, I do think there are areas of practical cooperation, trade. I would love to see a trans-Caspian engagement strategy, and it doesn't even have to require a delimitation of the Caspian Sea. That's a lovely stopgap issue, but we can pass that over. But inevitably, the countries in Central Asia tend to look in other directions, and so it's almost by default we don't have these linking together, although there can be a logic. Yeah.
John.
I would distinguish between politics or geography and culture. Mm-hmm. Certainly, in terms of geography, Azerbaijan is not part of Central Asia and will not be. Mm-hmm. In terms of culture and the links that come from culture, there is a commonality there which does not exist with the other countries of the Caucasus. But I would hesitate to talk about Azerbaijan out of the Caucasus because, in fact, the relationship between Azerbaijan and Georgia is very important for both countries. And you throw in Turkey and you have a trilateral mechanism, which is also very important for the geopolitics of the Caucasus.
Sultan?
From my point of view, the main idea of connecting through maybe between Central Asia and Azerbaijan is that pipelines, maybe energy. And the idea nowadays, the last 25 years, we discussed it with participation of Azerbaijan, United States, Russia, and all of countries of this region. But what is important now, we have agreement. We signed agreement in the 1990s that we share with Russia the space of water, but not under the land, but not the space of the water. It means that no one pipeline is impossible to build without Russia permission. And so that the main idea for Turkmenistan is to build such kind of pipelines through Caspian Sea and then to maybe Europe, I don't know exactly. But for us, maybe the idea to have another. But this is a part of contradiction between Russia and USA in this moment, because Russia doesn't want that Central Asian countries have the transport routes not maybe through Russia territory or maybe China. But United States last 25 years supported the idea to build new routes through Caucasian and maybe from the south. Yes, for more independence of the countries, for more choice of each country of Central Asia. But nowadays, I think this Trans-Caspian route may be not so important, and not because for us more important in this case Russian relationship with Russia in this case.
I would just add one thing. If we had an Iranian participant here, maybe they could give a coherent argument for why the North is a unified whole. But yeah, the rest of us might not be as successful.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question. Andy?
Thank you. The water issue has been alluded to by several panelists. When I spent a lot of time in Central Asia in 2014, 2015, I came away with the feeling that the most important issue for intra-Central Asian integration was water, water, and then water. So could we drill down a little further on that one, please? And sorry. And what do you see as the most significant kind of near-term watershed moments to look for? Sorry.
No more similes and metaphors, yes.
I'll take a quick stab at this because it's already been referred to as this reevaluation of the current Uzbek government on the Rogun Dam project. And I would just add, taking a step back, there's a great deal of discussion about scarcity of water in Central Asia. I would actually say it's more the mismanagement of water resources. And if there are more efficient, effective ways to use the water, all the better. This is one of the challenges that has to be done cross-border. There's no question riparian states have to get along. And I would argue bringing in Afghanistan with this C5 plus Afghanistan, water had better be on the agenda, because that's an Afghan problem as well in the north. But if there is a true view from Tashkent that this dam project, hydroelectric energy project in Tajikistan is actually something they won't vehemently object to, which they have done for so many years, can start to foster trade and cooperation and transit of even building equipment across the border. Huge steps in de-escalating tensions in the region. And for me, that's a wonderful test case to then see how one can start to cooperate in other river basins and in other areas where where cooperation on water issues is needed. So.
John? You want?
From my point of view, the problem of water in Central Asia, the main idea is that the next 10 years situation become worse. And we know it. And if nowadays it's possible to share, to have the agreement between countries, the mountain countries and the countries from the, from the steppe, it means it's possible to share the resources of water. But after 10 years, it's maybe not enough. And if Ragun or maybe Kambarata will build and will work, and of course it's profitable for maybe it's possible to sign some agreements that part of water through the summertime, because for Tajik and Kyrgyz, water needs through the winter time, but for Uzbekistan and for Kazakhstan, we need water through the summertime. It is absolutely different, and it's absolutely different understanding of using water. And if water became less quantity of water, it means that conflict, I think we understand that conflict will continue, and no idea to how to decide this problem in the long-term, middle-term perspective, we don't know in this situation.
Dean? Okay, well, please join me in thanking the panel for a very informative session. Thank you all.